Well, thanks everyone for joining us today for this discussion on
recording in progress
in tackling greenwashing, or as we've titled it, cutting through the greenwashing. Before we start, can we have a big round of applause for these panels that have joining us today? Just to introduce everybody, the lady who needs no introduction, sitting right in the center, we've got Esther Ahn, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of City Developments Limited. Esther was also named by Reuters as one of 25 trailblazing women in climate this year. So very privileged to have her with us today. On the end, we have Anil Chagaroth, who is a partner at RAPG Law Asia, who hosted today's session. He is also the co-head of ESG and partner of appropriate dispute resolution practices, as well as a chairperson for ESG working group at the Law Society of Singapore. So if you've got any legal questions, shoot them his way when it comes to greenwashing for this panel. Sitting beside Anil, we have Jasmine Tuan, who is the co-founder of Kloop, and that is a sustainability startup here in Singapore, and they're focused on closing the loop when it comes to fast fashion and sustainable fashion. Here, and sitting beside me, we have Robin Hicks, who is the associate editor of Eco Business, covered greenwashing quite a bit. If you follow him on LinkedIn, almost daily updates in terms of what's happening both in Singapore and the region. Last but not least, Quintin, who is the managing director of Zeno Carbon. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you all for joining us online and in person today as part of this press club session. Now, as many of you may be familiar with the term greenwashing, there was an article published in the Financial Times at the beginning of this month, and it stated that 70% of financial institutions were guilty of greenwashing. Well, what exactly is greenwashing? Okay, so we're going to find out. That's a good place to start. Oh, Asma, would you like to say a few words before we get started as well?
I think it's been overtaken by events. It's okay.
Oh, sorry, Asma, please come ahead. Yes.
I just want to say, my name is Asman. I'm sorry to be in front of the camera. Hi, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Asman. I'm the managing partner of RHT Law Asia, chairman of the ASEAN Plus Group, and the lead partner in our multidisciplinary organization called One RHT. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this timely seminar entitled Sustainable Journalism, Cutting Through the Greenwashing. Now, in the realm of journalism and reporting, there's an undeniable power. The power to inform, influence, and inspire change. And the era that we find ourselves in, with the very future of our planet at stake, this power is more critical than ever. You are storytellers, advocates, and catalysts for transformation. So climate change is a global challenge, one that transcends borders and unites us in a shared responsibility. It is a challenge that demands not just our attention, but our collective action. So your words hold the potential to sway public opinion, drive policy change, and encourage environmental stewardship. Enough from me. Thank you for joining us today. Please, can I hand everything over back to the hosts for you to continue with today's discussion. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With that, I think we'll start off with a question on what exactly is greenwashing. I think it's a term that many of us may be familiar with. It may sound simple, but I think from the discussions that I've had with many of you in the room prior to starting this session, as well as the discussions we've been having at Singapore International Energy Week, I think there's a consensus that when it comes to green or sustainability, not everybody agrees on the same description of the term. So let's find out from our panelists, everyone from very different industries. Robin, from your perspective, let's start off. What is greenwashing?
Yes, a very good question. I think the problem that we face is the definition keeps changing. And that's why I feel that companies, brands keep getting unstuck, because some greenwashing isn't actually intentional, right? So in a nutshell, it's making exaggerated sustainability related claim. I think just in one sentence I've had to define it. But yeah, as I mentioned, I think a lot of brands are running into problems because they're greenwashing unintentionally. But I would say the caveat that was saying, I think there's a study as well that about 80% of greenwashing is intentional. So it's brands trying to impress consumers or investors to get a competitive edge by appearing to be greener than they actually are.
And Esther, from that perspective, as a Chief Sustainability Officer, what is greenwashing?
Well, I think Robin defined it very, very well already. But on the other side, like for corporates, definitely for listed company, we have a lot of rules and regulations and all that we have to be very, very careful. Greenwashing is definitely, we do everything to make sure that we stay away from it and only set clear and credible targets that we are comfortable with, but still have to be ambitious enough. And I think, we have to also, communicate clearly in a transparent manner to make sure that, the message is clear. For sustainability reporting, which is my passion, as some of the friends who know that I have published 16 sustainability reports already, and we learn along the way that we set targets and we also must report in a transparent and a clear manner every year, and report the good and the bad so that you won't be deemed as greenwashing. And I would like to talk a little bit about greenwashing later on.
And maybe greenwashing as well, as you were sharing.
Yes,
before the
greenwashing.
session, there too. And Quintin, Xenocarbon, you've got.
Sure, yeah. I think the further we go, like the less there is to say, because like Robin did a very good job. But yeah, I mean, the way I personally think about it is really about like being misleading. So saying something and giving the wrong impression, and can be anything from, here you go, I got like a sustainable product, when I actually have nothing to back it up. And it can be intentional or not. But it's really about like that concept of being deceitful and giving an impression that is not actually the case.
Jasmine, anything to add?
I will put it in a different perspective. It's like a Tinder profile that you put up. It's all fluffed up. And then when you meet the person, it's not what he said he is. So that's, to me, is greenwashing.
That's a great way to put it. And Anil, from the legal perspective.
Okay, so
Yes.
legal,
Everyone's so serious.
let me just start with the first thing, right? This is what I read. I don't know whether it's true or not. This greenwashing thing started in 1986, apparently. An environmentalist had made issues about hotels asking their guests in relation to the use of towels, right? And these were the same hotels that were not paying attention to other things. And so the word, it was coined as environmental profitable but ineffective, environmentally conscientious acts of greenwashing. That's what it's called. All right. So a little bit of history. But from a legal point, I think something Robin mentioned is that it's not clearly defined what it is. Right. So what happens is, as we carry on this discussion, you realize that there are some regulations, there may be some acts. Then the question is whether or not it falls within those categories. So quick take on it is that you don't have to really worry about whether there's a definition. When there is a problem, you want to look at that problem in relation to maybe a set of regulation or an act, and take a look at what that act or the regulation provides, and then you cross-refer and see whether these people have complied with it. All right, so as we go on, I know it might seem daunting, but it's not that daunting if you take a step back. Just now earlier on, I can't remember, I think it was Robin and I were just having a quick discussion on that. Why aren't people in Singapore complaining about greenwashing? We'll come back to that in a while.
Yeah, I think we had that on the pre-panel discussion. And I think that's an important point that Robin's highlighted as well, that greenwashing may not be intentional. That's the whole thing. Where are the parameters? What is green? What is sustainable? There are so many regulations, and I think from a Chief Sustainability Officer perspective, Esther, correct me if I'm wrong, it can be difficult to keep up. What's the latest? Especially, in Europe, they're going to be rolling out legislation by 2026, and they're going to be banning neutral terms when it comes to carbon neutral terms to prevent greenwashing. So how do you start? There's a fear factor. If you want to go out and share that you are being more sustainable as a brand, but at the same time, you're scared. If I go out and I announce this to the public, I go and speak to the media, could I be seen as greenwashing? from the media's perspective, when they receive a barrage of emails and press releases that claim to be green, claim to be sustainable, how do you read between the lines? How do you ensure what you're being pitched isn't a greenwash? Robin, I'm sure that's an issue that you face every single day.
Yeah, it is absolutely, because Eco-Business was a sustainability publication. So we attract sustainability related pitches from companies of all descriptions, each claiming to be saving the world with varying degrees of credibility. But I would say this in the Singapore context, just an anecdote as a session we had training journalists here in Singapore. We had a session on for journalists and how to respond to greenwashing, which we gave a couple of international journalists actually. And someone came up to me after the session and said, listen, that was pretty interesting, but not relevant to me because I work for mainstream media in Singapore. And frankly, we don't have the opportunity to call out the government or companies for greenwashing, especially if they're state-linked. So there's a sense of quite a lot of self-censorship happening, perhaps in Singapore newsrooms. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm foreign to sort of make that assumption. But I think that's an issue. Also, green hushing. Esther mentioned green hushing. I'll just mention that briefly because, yeah, as a publication, I'm sure lots of publications are feeling the strain from falling advertising revenues at the moment. We're Eco-Business are as well, and I think that's partly a result of green hushing. Companies are less willing to talk about their sustainability achievements because they're frightened of getting called out for greenwashing. So.
And at the same time, when you're looking at advertising revenue as a publication, you may have sponsors that may want articles positioned in a certain way.
Yeah,
difficult balance.
Yeah, absolutely. I must say that obviously Eco-Business, the nature of our company is we attract lots of companies that might not necessarily be the greenest. So palm oil companies being one sector, and that's definitely an issue that I face as journalists, we face as a publication, is trying to write fairly and transparently about companies that are also potential sponsors. That's definitely an issue. And also myself as a journalist, I got called out for greenwashing a few weeks ago by someone who worked from a company said, listen, you've greenwashed. He wrote a letter of complaint to the editors. So he said you did not do a good enough job of scrutinizing this company and you've allowed them to greenwash. So I think it's a particularly difficult sort of issue to navigate as a journalist.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what you said because I've worked for both mainstream media here in Singapore, and I think when it comes to self-censorship, it really depends on who your editor is. I've been very fortunate in the past where I've had editors that have said, okay, you can work on the story, but just ensure that you have the means and the facts to back it up. And that's what it comes down to. But then ensuring that you know everything, Robin, otherwise you might get an email and somebody could say, hey, Rachel, you've been greenwashing too. So, there is a fear factor on both sides for companies, for PRs, for comms, for journalists when it comes to this issue. And when it comes to that, what are the legal repercussions of greenwashing here?
Okay, so if I could just take his point about, when you're writing articles, especially for journalists and all that, right? I mean, this is not something new. I think you should know. So instead of writing and saying, I think you're doing wrong, you could be writing and saying, I wonder, would you have to consider these things, right? And then highlight the kind of acts or regulations and just ask the questions as opposed to putting it out there and say, I'm challenging you and I think you're greenwashing. It kind of tones it down because again, it comes back from the fact that, the greenwashing, the definition is not clear, what the regulations are, it's not clear. So you may want to be more inquisitorial in your article and ask the questions of whether or not do we need to consider these A, B, C, D, and then do we need to consider, the other aspects, all right? So that's just taking Robin's point. On your point, legal implications a lot, there can be questions of whether or not, in Singapore, for example, there are questions of whether or not you're in compliance with the Consumer Act. There are certain provisions in the Consumer Act, Section 4, Section 9, 6, 7, and all that provide some guidelines. If you go on common law, there's a question of whether you misrepresented someone. So when you talk about misrepresentation, is that, I came to take a look at a product and you told me that this product is ABCD. It has got these elements. And because you told me that there are these elements, I purchased it. When I went back, I realized that these elements are not true. And as a result of that, I've suffered some damage. That's misrepresentation. So you have that angle as well. So there are quite a number of angles. There are examples. If that time permits, I can cite some of the examples that are happening around. But from a legal point, this is the complications you have. But we haven't reached the stage here in Singapore of taking on people and challenging them and putting them to task legally at the moment. Right? In Europe, you have the regulations that are coming in place, and therefore, because there's strict regulations in place, finding people who are in breach of those regulations are pretty easy. You know, that's what's going to happen. So we might get to that stage, but we're not there yet. But there are provisions, like I said, the Consumer Act, the Misrepresentation Act, and all these things. Right?
I'd like to go to Esther, because Esther, you've been flying the sustainability flag for many years for CDL. What are some of the challenges of the CSO in terms of navigating the current environment with regulations changing as rapidly as they are?
Yeah, honestly, as corporate, we are living in a very difficult world, you know. And the latest South Pole study showed that the whole world need $1 trillion to really fight, you know, for the survival of the planet by 2030. And $1 trillion is a lot, you know. And private sector are, you know, pinpointed as you guys have to do this, have to fund this $1 trillion. But at the same, another study showed that there's only 7% of globally all listed companies dare to make a bold commitment of net zero. And 48% among the biggest, 2,000 biggest listed company. So we are in, I think companies, I'm not just talking about us, it's businesses are in a really dilemma that on one hand, you're expected to invest in it. On the other hand, you have to really justify to your stakeholders, investors, why do I need to put the money in green, right? So it's also the ROI that, you know, investors are looking at. Why are you building green, you know, while, you know, you sell at the same market rate anyway? You can't, you know, sell it higher because consumers, especially in Singapore, they are not willing to share the prices yet. And I think they're also, you know, the level of green consumerism and preference is not there yet, not quite there yet, especially in Asia. So we are really like stuck in this, you know, in the center that you are expected to do more. And then when you look at global best practices, especially, you know, company have global presence, we operate in 29 countries and regions. We are not just looking at Singapore regulations and expectation. We also need to look at like, okay, global best practices, whether it's the MSCI, Dow Jones, FTSE, and also most important one is actually the SBTI, science-based target. When you set target, it should be backed by science, backed by data. It should not be, oh, that's my lucky number, 68%, that's it. You know? So we need to really back by science, which is actually very difficult. Yeah, so how do we strike that balance that you're expected to be ambitious to drive change.
And realistic at the same time.
And you also have to like, and then if you are setting target that is not ambitious enough, SBTI say, no, go back to your drawing board. And in fact, it is known fact that SBTI is really throw away, you know, reject a lot of application. For us, it took us 8 months to convince them. My first set of target is that too easy, please go back. And SBTI is meant to be whip you from behind. You can't achieve it today or tomorrow, but give you by 2030, you better work very hard this, you know, 10 years, you know, at that time it was 2017 when we applied. So it was like, we still have a lead time, but today businesses are facing even more, you know, harder, you know, really harder challenges because the lead time is only like less than 7 years now. And on the other hand, you also have to convince your stakeholders and your, you know, top bosses, top management that can we set this target? Can we talk about it? And that is where greenwashing is all about. That, you know, a lot of company, like 25% of companies who were researched by South Pole, that they say they are not going to talk about publicly any target. Their sustainability officers are now
in case they can't reach the goal.
Yeah,
And
so it's really very, very challenging for sustainability professionals. Yeah, and then we are pushing for reporting, transparent and prompt reporting. On the other hand, it's like you feel like you are gagged, you know, because don't ask for trouble, just keep quiet.
Quentin, does that sound familiar with the conversations that you're having with clients when it comes to sustainability practices and when they're reaching out to you for advice on how they can drive things forward?
Sadly, yes. I think like a lot of the companies, they will fall into accidental greenwashing because of the pressure that's put on them. So right now it's on the news all over the place, so they feel like they gotta do something. They don't necessarily understand everything that they're doing, especially if you talk to SMEs, right? A lot of them, they're not like super literate about carbon and sustainability and ESG. So they end up like making those claims, and this can really backfire. And what worries me even more than greenwashing, which is like people not talking about what they do, is people not doing anything at all. Because it reminds me like of like that professor, like just on the tangent, like when I was young, I had like this ruthless professor. So he would ask questions and you answer, and if you get the slightest thing wrong, it will like scream at you, like throw pencils and everything. And the result is like every time you ask a question, nobody would reply. And I think we've seen like some of that in the carbon markets. So the Guardian came up with an article. They, went really hard on South Pole and a couple of other consultancies, Vera, etc., on issuing carbon credits that should have never been issued. But the result is that not everybody's in a state of paralysis. Nobody wants to touch carbon credits anymore. So I'm not saying that it was wrong what they did, because they should definitely call out the problems in the carbon credit markets. But I think we need also to think about like forgiveness, right? Can we like tolerate like some mistakes? Because if we don't tolerate that, we'll end up with people that are doing nothing because they're just too scared to be called out.
And transition period, isn't that right? And I think there was a term that Esther mentioned just before we got onto the panel, and that was greenwashing, which to me sounds a little bit more frightening than greenwashing and green hushing. And greenwashing, Esther, as you shared, it's people with all talk and no action.
It's actually like you just go out and make really big wishes, statement that we are so great about, we definitely do all sort of things, but without measurable commitment. So it's really like a PR talk. And in fact, there's also one of the university invited me to give a talk to a course called Sustainability Marketing. So I said, I'm afraid I cannot condone that. I cannot talk about, because I said sustainability is not marketing pitch, So I said, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I think that's the danger of like sustainability now. People think that, it can help us raise funds from banks. It can help us, attract ESG investment. It can also help us sell the product. Yeah. So, but I think that will invite backfire. It's a very dangerous thing. Product stewardship has to come through what you promise, and the whole strategic commitment must align with everything you do, practices, product, and stakeholder engagement and all that. And in fact, now stakeholder engagement is very important. Actually, we've been working with Jasmine before, even zero waste and sustainable fashion and all. So I think nowadays with so advanced communication. Before we finish this session, I'm sure some of you may have posted it online on social media already. So I think we have to be very truthful, very transparent, and very credible.
And going to Jasmine now, we've just spoken about greenwashing, and I know as a sustainability startup, it can be a challenge to ensure that you have the right partners, to ensure that, when you're having these conversations with recycling facilities in Malaysia, for example, you're not there, you're not on the ground, to ensure that they are not greenwashing, they're not greenwashing you into doing business with them. How did you get around that, starting up Clue 3 years ago? So you just celebrated their 3rd anniversary.
Yes. So yeah, just last weekend, I'm still recovering from it. Thank you for the question. Talking about partnership, and this whole topic, we first do what we can do locally. So as Clue, we're barely scraping the icing of a cake of a problem, to be honest. So we've been collecting clothes from our friends, our family, and then starting with the one collection point, but it was very inconvenient because we could only collect good, clean, wearable clothes. And slowly, we could, we circulate them through fashion swap, some activities that we can do locally, but it was really, really small. And thankfully in 2019, when I was living and working in Malaysia, I met this recycling partner who sorts in detail. I'm like, wow, you actually exist. There's such a solution out there already, but how come not much people know about you? And it was only in Malaysia. And thankfully, fast forward many years later, he decided to expand to Singapore, and that's why we partner out and can do nationwide textile recycling bin rollouts. And now we can accept not just good, clean, wearable clothes, we can also accept old, worn out household linen, toys, pillows, etc. and 360 bins now in Singapore. So yeah, so that's why we can now scale up and we can now potentially double the textile recycling rate in Singapore. And how do we know whether he is, credible or not? Thankfully, I've seen his factory in 2019. He used to only have 300 categories that he sought through, but today he has more than 500 categories that he sought through. Yeah, from all the donations that we collected in Singapore, and not just in Singapore, he also collects in Malaysia. So yeah, and we also go to his factory to take a look, and he is very transparent and open. What he can do, he will say he can. What he cannot do, he will tell you he cannot do. So he's very realistic. He's not like wishing or like talking big. He just say, yes, there's technology out there. I'm not sure yet. I'm sure he will be very honest about where he's at now. And he's still constantly researching, finding out what is possible and what is not possible in his industry. And for us, Clue also, we know what we can do as a small organization, and we know what we cannot do. So we partner with credible players like Lifeline Clothing, which is my recycling partner. And before that, before meeting him, there's also many recyclers out there who wants the clothes that we cannot circulate locally. But we ask a lot of questions. We're like, what happened after that? What do you do with the clothes? And then they have no answers for us. And we know in our intuition also tells us that no, he's not the right one. So trust your instinct and, just ask a lot of good questions. And if not, go down and check out their work sites and ask a lot of questions. And if something doesn't sit right with you, just, you know what to do. Yeah.
And Jasmine, I'm sure you are approached quite frequently by corporates who are looking to jump on the sustainability bandwagon and loop in Club to put their name out there as being green, being sustainable, having initiatives. How do you tackle that?
Wow, there's two types. There's so many angles to it, right? We want to educate. So when they engage us to talk to their employees, because it has to start from within the companies, right? So we work with many brands, whether they are green or not, because we want to educate. We want to share, sustainable practices and also fashion. So we don't judge. I mean, we try to work with everybody and try to educate as much as we can, whether you are green or not. Whereas brand, we try to leverage our brand. Then we are very careful. We can be beaten once or twice, but no more 3 times. Meaning, yeah, we do get brands like that. We just want to use Club's brand to make them look green, leveraging. But when we found out what happened, we will feedback constructively, and we won't work with them in the future. Or maybe we can still work together, but how can we then have a more respectful relationship, honest relationship? Yeah, otherwise, nah. No more second time. Yeah, once bitten, twice shy, right?
Do you think, and
Catch you.
This is a question for you, Neil. Do you think then that more regulation is needed when it comes to sustainability initiatives and greenwashing here in Singapore?
Eventually, yes, right, but it's going to take time, right? I mean, Europe has started and we're going to come up with the regulations and put in place. Many of us in Asia would think that it's not relevant. But if we do supply and we do produce and we do sell to Europe, you're going to have to take that into consideration. So if they have these regulations in place, why aren't we doing anything about it? So it takes a little bit of time, and why I say it takes a little bit of time is some of the things that we've all said. She says that she's going to go and check and ask the right questions. I did something to Pro Bono SG had a talk on with charities, because there's a code of practice that's going to come out in January. And in my discussion with them, I said, what you can do is that the code of practice has got these set guidelines, right? Put it in a table as a checklist. When you are engaging with parties, then start ticking those boxes and see. So while the regulations are slowly going to come into place, what my suggestion is that you kind of put a checklist together and work it through. So the kind of questions that she asked, Esther talked about, whether it's really sustainable or not, people saying that it is, but how far forward are they? I had this quick example I read on Google somewhere. This gentleman said that if by 2035, he's going to stop drinking beer, right? He says, he wants to do that because he thinks that helps the environment. He's going to talk to his friends. He'll still hang out with his friends for now, but slowly cut down the amount of beer he drinks, and by 2035 he's going to this thing. And then he signs off. He's 87 years old. Right? So people go out there and say that they're going to do these things, but what do they do about it? I just did a course on carbon management to figure out how the carbon credits are allocated and all that. So while many companies are saying they want to go and do this, what are they doing internally? Do they have a framework? Do they have a checklist? By God's grace, our firm working with the Institute of Banking Association, I think the Singapore Institute of Banking Association, they asked us to test out the software and check on our water supply, our travel, our paper usage and all that. And we struggle, our HR and our finance struggle because we have not only RST legal, they only wanted it from the legal point, but we also have RST consulting and a group of companies. So we had to split it all up, and the HR and finance took about 2 months to put all this down. But it's an exercise we're doing. So while we are talking about this point about whether regulations should be there, there should be something in the future. It must be, and it has to be across the world. It has to be standardized somewhere or somehow. All right, how they're going to do that, that's a big thing. I suppose UN has to work with that, right? But before we get there, we ourselves want to put these things in place, the checklist, the guideline, and then work through that.
And I think when you have a checklist and a guideline, it must also, Esther, I think you mentioned this, offer solutions for CSOs and corporates. So it's not just outright banning carbon neutral terms, but
I think apart from, I think for Singapore, we are very fortunate. A lot of certification, and, for our building, definitely Green Mark is the official authorities to, set very clear whether you're Gold Plus or Platinum or super low energy. So that already can give, our tenants and our home buyers the assurance, because it's not like internal that we claim that, it is actually, you have to really go through very robust checking, For Green Mark, actually, we are one of the most robust green building standard in the world. And in fact, in 2017, that's how it passed the so-called a test, because when we rolled out the first green bond, and green bond initiative based out in UK, in London, they said, oh, sorry, Green Mark is not on our list. There's only LEEDs, BREEAM, and all those green building standards, so no Green Mark. So that's why I work with BCA and send them the whole BCA, all the the requirement and all that. And over one day, he came back and said, "Oh, yeah, you are more robust than some of the other green building standard in the world." So I think for Singapore, we are quite safe in that sense. When you declare something, if you are certified, it's fine. Like wood, cross-laminated timber, it is certified by Nature Barcode, and also wood has a lot of certification. But right now, like when we want to look for sustainable building material, cement, sand are the challenge. Steel also this challenge. The supply is still in a very nascent stage. So, but as much as company wants to, procure in a sustainable manner, we have to face the reality that you have to strike the balance, availability, and also whether it is, the business case is there. Yeah, so I think we are all learning by doing. It's not easy, but we welcome clear regulations. Really, you set the markers so you don't go OB without knowing that you have crossed the line.
And speaking of crossing the line, I know you were going to mention some examples of companies that have crossed the line and gotten into.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to take a look at this, but there were cases like, hang on a second, the Shell had been, or the Dutch Royal Shell, right? A way in which activists may employ legal venues to hold companies accountable for the impact. The Dutch environmental organization, Friends of the Earth, Netherlands, filed a lawsuit against Shell to compel them to reduce carbon emission. So that was an example. There's another one. Volkswagen had collected the data, and then the records showed that the data was inaccurate, and they got into trouble. Where else? There were a few others. In Washington, D.C., the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Goldman Sachs. This was in November last year. All policies and procedures failure involving mutual fund and one separately managed account, strategy, marketing as environmental, social, and governance. So there's a whole lot of cases that are coming out. And you find that most of these cases are out in the Europe or in the US because their regulations are becoming a little bit more crystal clear, right? So that's why people are taking them on, right? So something we had a discussion with before we started. So why aren't Singaporeans then using this greenwashing issues and raising issues with products and then taking it to the Consumer Association? I suspect that people know that there is a problem. I suspect they don't know that it's categorized as greenwashing because you also have blue washing, by the way. So
And
blue washing is
whitewashing?
blue washing involves social and economic issues that arise, right? So people don't know how to park it into a category, but they know that there are problems, right? So I suppose it all collectively works, once you get your regulations in place, once people have the knowledge and the exposure, and then what Esther said about the Building and Construction Authority and the green mark, right? Once people realize that these things are crystal clear, then they'll start picking up and listen, I want you to show me proof that your what you do and what you say is right. Right? So
Robin, I'm sure you have something to add to that.
Yeah, just to add to that, and that's interesting, because Singapore's quite a complaints-based culture, right? It's quite surprising to some extent that people don't complain about greenwash. I did a podcast with a chap called Kim Schumacher, who's an expert on greenwashing. He said, he could well be out of line saying this, but it could be even a cultural issue. There isn't that culture in Singapore and other countries in Asia of complaining about governments or businesses, and there's an assumption that you'll leave it to the government to sort out rather than personally take it upon yourself to complain about it. Could be completely wrong, this is a theory. But a number of companies that if those laws in Europe were applied in Singapore or Asia would find themselves in serious trouble. Petronas is one of my favorite examples, claiming to be net zero by 2050 to Esther's point about greenwashing, with no interim targets, not science-based at all. And their CEO said it's an aspiration that will be, and how can you get away with saying that? It's incredible. But to the point about the media, the Malaysian press did not touch it. I mean, Petronas is a sacred cow, right? You just leave it alone. It's a revered institution that's unquestioned. So what it says is unquestioned, but I think the media did a really bad job in Malaysia of questioning that. Here in Singapore, you've got loads of energy companies, especially around gas. There's been loads of gas companies, City Energy being one, Sing Gas being another, are calling natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, environmentally friendly. I think that, again, if there was legislation in place, these companies would get a slap for that. I mean, personally, I have a problem with Singapore's city and nature claim. I mean, that's, for me, I'm going to say this, but I think it's state level greenwash. City and nature, where secondary forests are being cut down all over the country, and we're claiming to be a city and nature. I find that really hard to swallow. But as a platform, City and Nature was designed back in the 60s to attract investment capital into Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew loved the idea of tree-lined streets, lush avenues from the airport to the CBD to make investors feel welcome. It's a way to basically attract revenue to the country. But to claim that we're city and nature when, as we all know, forests are being converted all over the country, I find personally quite hard to swallow.
But I think if you compare that to other major cities such as New York, London, Dubai, where I've just flown in from, I mean, the greening of Singapore is undeniable in comparison to other major cities.
Yeah.
So I think there are always pros and cons with every kind of situation.
I'd agree with that. Just on City and Nature, that platform is now being copied by the Indonesians in Nusantara. If you listen to Jokowi, he's using similar language. He wants to build a sustainable forest city, which sounds very similar to City and Nature. And by the way, Nusantara, the Indonesian government, are desperate for investment to build that new capital. So it's a strategy, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that these policymakers care about nature or conservation. They want to use greenery literally as a way to attract capital. So.
Speaking of using greenery and the built environment, Esther, what's your take on that in terms of Singapore?
Yes, actually, I have also learned a new term called nature positive. We were all struggling for the net neutrality, and then nature positive. That is what it is, advocating by World Economic Forum and all. It's just, yeah. But I would like to say something. I'm not government spokesman, but I think city and nature is one of the 5 pillars of the Singapore Green Plan, and it's an aspiration by 2030.
Right, yeah.
But I think the fact remains that Singapore, being a small country, we are one of the highest green coverage, which I think think it is admirable, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt that we all work together and hopefully we can achieve a city in nature, which is also a global aspiration that to be in order to help the planet to really to contain global warming. We can't fight with nature. We have to really look to nature as like not just conserve it, but also regeneration of resources, putting back resources or waste back into the loop. So that is exactly what we are looking at. When we are looking at sustainable building material, we are also looking at circular economy, and research actually show that for the world to transition to net zero, only 55% solutions are from energy, renewable and efficiency. 45% rely on very much on circular economy solutions. But we are all, we have to look at it above, all these so-called, clutter. We just have to look at it in a bigger picture that we all share one planet. Let's have faith in each other. Let's play our own role. That now why we engage our SME, and we are not trying to find fault, but their carbon footprint is my carbon footprint, the scope 3, because I have to explain to them that, hey, sorry, supplier, you have to be green because your footprint is my scope 3, embodied carbon, which is a big percentage. So a lot of companies, businesses are still learning. And we don't want that fear factors to really turn people off. And especially in reporting, we are still in a maze. Despite the fact that the past 2 years, the global efforts to harmonize standards and ratings and ranking and benchmark, the whole world has about 600 such benchmark and standards and rating. So
600, 600.
That is from the, from ERM, which is a leading consultant. And it is not easy, sustainability. It is still, in this transition, everybody is trying to learn more and give opportunity to people. People do make mistakes and give a chance to them. And for those who are starting out, and SME especially, our supply chain, we take it as our our responsibility to engage them, because when they supply green, we will benefit as well. That's why we have the Sustainability Academy opened in 2017, and we have every day we have courses and training on green building materials, sustainable energy. So we try, I think as a nation, we should try. As an industry, we should do together rather than point finger at each other. Sometimes, when you're, growing older, you tend to be more zen, like, let's be more forgiving. Let's tell them that this is not the right thing to do and to give them solutions. Yeah.
And I think that's a perfect point. So we've spent the last 40 minutes discussing some of the challenges, getting a lay of the land, and perhaps some of the potential regulations that we would like to see, could see, but let's spend the next 20 minutes before we take questions from the floor and online. If you're watching online, send me a question on Zoom. I'm monitoring here and we'll answer those at 1:30. But let's now take 20 minutes to talk about the opportunities for journalists, for industry, from the legal profession. Robin, you mentioned earlier that you had a session with journalists about tackling greenwashing. And some of the journalists mentioned that we don't have the bandwidth to uncover greenwashing. We're scared to uncover greenwashing. What would you say to those in the media, those who are looking to follow a similar path to you, to cover sustainability, when it comes to tackling issues like greenwashing, when it comes to covering sustainability? What are the words of wisdom or advice that you would share?
Yeah, I think the advice is pretty similar. I mean, I think most journalists in Singapore instinctively know the OB markers, right? How to navigate sensitive topics, especially when writing about, I would say also, by the way, we've been very critical of government agencies, NEA, especially around its waste policy. And I must say they were fantastic in their response. They said, right, we appreciate your point of view. Frankly, gave them a kicking about their waste policy. And they invited us in to speak to a couple of their executives.
Did that surprise you?
It really did, yeah. I think different government agencies are different, right? Thicker skinned than others. But obviously need your facts watertight. If you're writing a story about greenwashing, you also need to give the right to reply. It's an obvious sort of format for how to do a story on greenwashing. But yeah, I think personally, I find it super enjoyable. I think journalists love writing about irony, and that's in a nutshell what greenwashing is. It's hypocrisy, right? And I think most journalists like calling out things that they feel that the public or investors are being lied to about. So I think it has huge appeal, but yeah, you just have to tread carefully.
When you, I mean, how many press releases would you say you receive on a daily basis?
My inbox has got about, in the eco-business, what, 70? I've got about 50,000 unopened.
Robin, so when you look, okay, but so when you open your inbox, you've got 50,000 unread emails. Okay, what makes you want to open up a? I mean, we've got PR professionals and clients in the audience. What makes you think a pitch is worthy to open, to read, and follow up on?
Okay, in the context of greenwashing, that pretty much the only emails that I'll open that I find interesting usually are written by NGOs, because they do a lot of the investigative legwork around greenwashing stories anyway. Greenpeace are great. Also locally here, I think there's some pretty good NGOs that try their best. Zero Waste SG, PM.Hey is pretty good. But yeah, anything that, my pet peeve is opinion pieces that don't have an opinion. You get so many of those written by PR agencies that, hey, this is this issue, and they've done about a few hours of desk research, put it together and sent it off to us. I've never published anything like that. So they lack an opinion. It's basically native advertising. It's here's a problem. Oh, the world's screwed up in whatever ways. There's a waste problem. There's an energy problem. And by the way, here at Company X, we have solution Y to solve right at the bottom of the.
Would you like to interview?
Yeah, exactly.
And with you PR professionals that are joining us online and in the audience, because we know that you've got stakeholders, you've got clients that are reaching out to you that say, hey, we want to talk about this, we want to talk about ESG, we're green, we're sustainable, and you got to push back, and it's not easy.
Yeah, I really sympathise with PR professionals getting a story that's read, that's sustainability focused. Because I tell you what, people don't like reading about basically depressing issues. I think that's a big problem we have at eco-business. People just tune off. It's another story about climate and environmental degradation. It's really hard to gain traction. The stories, a friend at SCMP was saying that she really hates writing stories about sustainability because even page views wise, there's in fact a friend at Malaysian Press as well was saying intrigue and the sense that you're calling out a company or government that's basically lying to people. That's why I think people like engaging with greenwashing content compared to say a story about sea level rise or extreme weather. So yeah, it's just a real challenge to make what is a very important topic interesting, right? It really is.
And Quinton, from your perspective, when you're speaking to clients, how are you advising them to navigate? What are the opportunities for them to turn their perhaps their perceptions around to become more aware of where they are on the sustainability and the green front? Maybe you can share a bit more about what Zuno Carbon does and how you work with your clients on that.
Yeah. And I can relate to what Robin just said, because when I personally did my first sort of press work, I was asked to write an article from our PR agency, and they told me exactly the same thing. Don't make it this very generic article. Just state a couple of facts about the IPCC, and then put your boilerplate of the company at the bottom of the article, and then on top of that you can add all those cliche image with the sprout between the hands with the soil. I think we've all seen that.
Please don't do that.
or the money that grows, the tree that grows out of money. Yeah. I mean, I've used those in the past, right? Yeah. But now I know better. So yeah, I think it just comes with experience, right? There's a learning curve, including for clients. Because yeah, I mean, on day one, I would have made a lot of mistakes as well, right? So when I look at some of the communications of my clients, right now I can look at it and be quite critical and say, yeah, this is not up to the standard that what we want to do. But if I backtrack maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I knew a lot less, would have I done better? Not really sure. So I think it's also embarking a lot of knowledge. That's one of the first steps that I always encourage for any client, or whether you're a journalist or PR agency. I think education is really important. Before you want to talk about something, try to learn about it. And that's what I live by every day, even now. I continue to learn. I'm far from being an expert. I don't even know any so-called sustainability expert. It's like such a broad field that it's impossible to know it all. So I think this really learning is very important, and I'm glad that in Singapore, the government is also pushing on that. So we've seen Enterprise Singapore, IMDA, etc. They're really pushing and trying to enable small and medium businesses to step up to the challenge. Because as Esther said, they're all part of the supply chain. So right now we see a lot of SMEs that are like the number one question is like, where do I start? Like they don't know, like do I start reporting with GRI, ISSB? Do I start a carbon footprint? Do I make a sustainability report? Like they're like a little bit clueless. So I think we also need like a lot more professional. I think that's one of the challenge that I see in my clients and even in my business is like getting quality, knowledgeable, sustainability professional is hard to come by these days. There's a lot of like great young people that are really passionate, but like if you look at senior expert, it's getting very rare and very expensive. So I think there's a couple of challenges that needs to be addressed. And I mean, for me, that's why I look a lot at, around education. Yeah.
And Jasmine, from your perspective then, as a small startup, what are some of the words of advice or words of wisdom that you would have to others that are looking to start their journey on the sustainability path, but they don't want to be perceived as greenwashing? What are some of perhaps the tough lessons that you learned early on? Now 3 years wiser, what would you say?
No, okay, not the best answer, but I learned from my own mistakes as a shopaholic. I used to shop so much. So I come from a consumer point of view. I also have a business before and I failed miserably. So I learned from being a consumer and I learned from being a poor business owner. I put these two together to come up with a solution. Also the timing helps. So at the right timing and coming out with this solution now that works for myself. And I spread this to fashion lovers alike. We all wear clothes, but we don't usually think about where does the clothes end up, even if after we donate it. So then start to look for answers and then solutions and then apply on my own lifestyle. If I use it myself, it works for me, and I hope that it works for everyone else. So I think that's my best filter system. If it works for me, it's good for me. I approved it. Okay, y'all can have now. If it doesn't, then it shouldn't come out of it. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing, Jasmine. And Neil, from a legal perspective, so we spoke a little bit before we set up here in front of everybody about legal ramifications and some of the concerns that corporates have when it comes to voicing sustainability, voicing their ESG initiatives, the political angle when it comes to ESG, perhaps not so much here in Singapore, but in Europe and the US. What would you say to corporates who are looking to publish or discuss or just reach out and let people know what they're doing on the ESG, green, sustainable front, that are now perhaps a little bit nervous about voicing what they're doing for fear of being deemed to be or labeled a greenwasher?
Okay, so 3 points on that. The first is the fact that at the moment you find that ESG consulting is where people are turning to. And you know, we have a ESG green, we just got Abe who's just come on board from the consulting point of view. And you find that accountants and sustainable people who have been in the sustainable industry and have done programs of that are what you turn to first, all right? So you have that consultancy angle. We have a lot of the accounting firms have all gone down that path. So that's the starting point. From the legal point, okay, so 50% of my work is construction, and I do a whole lot of other things as well. So a lot of people have been asking me, have I re-engineered myself in hitting the ESG? And I said, no, it's not re-engineering. If you look at environmental aspects, you're entering into an agreement. You want to make sure that your supply chain is right. You want to make sure that your investors know where you're getting your supplies from and all those. Those are front-end advisory work. So that's legal, right? When those fall out and there are problems, it turns into a dispute. You need a dispute practitioner on board. That's environment. If you look at social includes your employer-employee relationship, your third party, your contractors, subcontractors, stakeholders, right? Again, when you're entering into the agreement, you need the front-end advisory work, right? And when it falls out, you need a dispute resolution person. And governance includes aspects of how you're shareholding and all that. And when it falls out, meaning your shareholder disputes, your minority shareholder problems and all that becomes disputes as well. So people are starting to realize, and I think a lot of the youngsters also starting to realize when they come into legal practice, they don't want to be dispute resolution practitioners, or they don't want to be corporate practitioners, they want to be ESG practitioners. So you're going to find a lot more legal aspects needing to come into play. At the moment when I work with Green, RSD Green, maybe 90% of it is consultancy part, but only 10% is legal, but that's going to change, right? So that's the second point. The third point is in my role with the Law Society, we are actually working with the Institute of Singapore Chartered Accountants to develop programs for both lawyers and accountants to move them forward. Because of our working group in the Law Society, Ministry of Law has come to me, Enterprise Singapore has come to me, Economic Development Board has come to me, and they want to know what we're doing to empower legal and the accountants. The accountants are ahead of us, far ahead of us. So we are putting into place a framework for the law societies specifically. First is to educate the lawyers on the ESG. Two is to see whether or not their businesses can be ESG'd up. Right? And three, for them to be able to do base work opinions and advice to all kinds of clients. So the legal part is going to start to take a bigger role. Right? In Europe and in the States, because they've got a clearer framework and they've got clearer regulations, that's why they've been taken to task. You know, you started off talking about the Reuters report. On the 3rd of October this year, the Reuters report.
70% of financial institutions. Yeah.
There's a jump into 140 over cases on breaches and all of that from 86 or something like that. And 50% of that relates to oil and fuel and fossil fuel. So you're starting to see all of that. Now, to deal with that, you need legal. So when you talk about opportunities, I know this is the wrong crowd I should be pitching to. I should be pitching to young lawyers who are coming out into practice. But the legal element is going to take a bigger role as we move forward.
And speaking of upskilling the next generation of workforce when it comes to sustainability, we've got to talk about the demand for CSOs, Chief Sustainability Officers. I mean, because we need somebody to safeguard all of these listed companies, corporates, to help them navigate the murky world of sustainability regulations, or to navigate the many, many different types of regulations out there. Esther, what words of wisdom would you have for up and coming CSOs or those who are looking to enter into that arena?
Well, there are plenty actually, especially after Babida launched the CSO series in January this year, and suddenly everybody wants to be a CSO. So I think I will look at it like, I've been being one for almost 20 years now. We have to really look at passion, and like what Quintin say, every day I'm reading. You know, I mean, I'm considered as an old timer, but every day I'm reading. There are always new things, new laws, new regulations, new practices. And just looking at sustainability reporting alone can make you stay awake at night already. There's so many, you just all the acronym, we call it the hot soup, right? You have the GRI, ISSB, SASB, CDSB, TCFD. Before you can manage TCFD, TNFD is coming out, nature related financial disclosure. So there's so many of such, standards and rating. You still need to look at it, how it applies to your own company to report in, to the qualities that we want and the investors want. Before, I always call it, this is still a storm before the calm rather than the calm before the storm. And not until the standardization can really reach a so-called single standard, which I have doubt that it will happen, because single is not possible, because the whole world is so diverse. Businesses, there are so many different sectors, different sizes, and different contexts of the whole world. I don't think one standard can fit all. Maybe now we are looking at ISSB plus GRI, which is looking at financial impact and, impact on the environment and on people. So I hope this combination will probably provide a bit of solutions. May not be perfect, but come November 20th, there will be an announcement between the two leading standard sector. There are a lot to learn, and there's a lot of opportunities, not just for legal profession, but even bankers. Nowadays, they also have advisory. They have advisory to tell you that what are the gaps of your policy practices, and they have solutions. They link you up with technology and solution provider. And these are not cheap, right? I can lend you money. So that's how the whole, the whole realm of services from bankers. So there are a lot of new technology, definitely. We are looking at technologies that can absorb heat, the paint that can absorb heat rather than reflect heat. So there are a lot of technologies available there, and but we have to link it through how are you going to fund it. Sustainable finance is a big agenda. So there are a lot of opportunities out there, but you must have the passion. You must have the will to look for solutions. If you don't care about the world, you don't even know the pain points, nothing will drive you to look for solutions.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, because there's another type of greenwashing that isn't talked about that much, is known as competence greenwashing or skills greenwashing. There aren't many people like Esther who have 20 years experience in sustainability. There frankly are not enough people in Singapore or Hong Kong or similar markets to do the jobs that we need to do in companies to transition to a greener economy, which is a massive problem. There's a huge skills gap at the moment, which is a sort of story that hasn't been covered that much, but needs to be. So there's a lot of people going into interviews claiming to have skills that frankly they don't have. And there's certain courses you can go on, University of Cambridge sustainability course that takes you 6 weeks, but it doesn't make you a sustainability expert to know the nuance of how sustainability in business or government works together. So I think that's a huge issue that is covered enough is competence greenwash.
And on that note, I'm just mindful of time. I'd like to open up to the audience if anyone has any. Yes.
Okay, Esther, thank you so much. You've got 20 years of experience and over. So I'd like to start with you. Esther, it sounds like you're struggling with meeting the regulations in OB markers, which is reactive. Yes, it's not proactive. So Pope Francis, in his latest letter, Laudate Deum, he calls for a new process that's just, intense, and counts on the commitment of all to enable international politics to recover the credibility in a concrete manner, to prevent even greater evils over time. Pope Francis also asked strategists, like all of you seated here, okay, and over here, thank you so much, yeah, to consider the common good, future of children, over short-term country and business interests. From a very passionate, purposeful, nature, positive perspective, allow me to challenge you, Esther, in your company.
Sorry, I didn't get your
Hang
name.
on, my name is Helena Chu.
Okay.
Yeah. Allow me to challenge you to spearhead an integrated architectural development that is carbon negative and self-sustaining. As to the journalists here, as well as the PRs here, instead of negatively portraying radicalized personnel to attract attention, let us use advocates. Pope Francis says that these advocates are actually
Helen, yeah, I'm
challenging her.
No, can we have Helena, thank you very much. We have quite a number of questions in the audience, so can I ask that you cut to the question and then we can
Yes,
carry
so
on?
there are two parts to it. One is the
Question,
developer
please. Yes.
and the other one is the
question
journalist.
for the panelists, please. Thank you very much, Helena.
So, okay, allow me to challenge you to take on this project of negatively to come up with a carbon negative and self-sustaining development. Tell me your challenges. Thank you.
I think it's all about teamwork.
Yes.
Construction is not as simple. So definitely it is on the agenda, and I'm very active on the World Green Building Council. It's not just about Singapore, it's just about one person, one company.
Yes.
In fact, we are all sharing the same planet. Yes. So I think it will be quite simplistic to take on your challenge. I will be very prudent. I hear you, and I will definitely, actually, our BCA have already 6 versions of Green Building Master Plan. And the latest 2021 is not just about green, it has to be super low energy. So it is very challenging, and the whole world is being challenged. The industry is being challenged. I hear you, and I'm not saying just about me, the challenges is actually about across all the sustainability professions. And definitely we hear you, and nature positive, nature and even carbon negative is a lot of talk that we also need to have people who are not in the industry to really understand what they are talking about. Definitely. Yes, okay, thank you.
Could I just add to that, just very quickly? You're starting with carbon negative. That in itself, how do you define that? How do you calculate that? How do you work it out? It's not as straightforward. Two is you start talking about architectural work. Architectural work in itself is a very specialized. I mean, I do construction work and I'm passionate about it. So putting out a challenge that's a very broad, you know, working down the nitty-gritties. She's picked out on some of them, including what the Building and Construction Authority is doing. So, you know, when you make statements like that, it's all encompassing. It's a tough thing to do, right? But you know, appreciate the
It has
comment.
already been achieved by 2 bungalows in Singapore, so that is my model we can follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you for your question. Thank you,
Thank you,
Esther.
thank
And
you.
Neil and Glenn, you have a question.
Yeah. Glenn Van Zutphen from Money FM. Something that Jasmine, you and Quentin said earlier struck me, which is we need, from a reporting standpoint, we need to give some amount of flexibility or leeway to organizations that say they are on this journey, rather than just jumping down their throats, why haven't you done more? So I get that. On the other hand, Robin, it was just a year ago you wrote the article about DBS being the eco warrior, more like an eco warrior, less like a bank debacle that social media blew up over. And I'm still seeing a lot of that cynicism and hyperbole from a lot of organizations that goes a bit further than what you guys are talking. They're not just asking for a little space, they're actually coming up with taglines, marketing slogans, and things like that. And from a reporting standpoint, it's really hard to understand how to handle that dichotomy, right? I guess, Robin, this would be for you since you're in it every day, and maybe even you, Rachel, too. Where are you landing on trying to figure that out?
Yes. So the DBS thing was interesting. I think that was just that example. It was unfortunate corporate communications. So Piyush Gupta, the CEO of DBS Bank, he had this a quote from one of his speeches. It was actually fairly legitimate. It's like, listen, we're struggling to. We feel actually that in some occasions we should be funding coal-fired power stations in parts of Asia which still lack electricity. And there's a certain moral argument for that. But and he says it's very difficult for him as a CEO to justify transitioning away from coal-fired power overnight. But the problem is they then stuck a slogan more like an eco-warrior, less like a bank, which was just went too far. You know what I mean? It's the CEO saying something, but it's then the marketing team jazzing it up on LinkedIn, spinning it. So I found a lot of people in the sustainability community really bolt at that. So I think, talking about sustainability reports, actually, and Esther can talk about this as well. There's a new concept that's coming out of the communications industry called corporate vulnerability. Right, so where companies don't just in their sustainability reports talk about awards, achievements, unverified sustainability claims. They talk about challenges, difficulties of meeting sustainability targets, areas where they've failed, they've gone wrong, which you read most sustainability reports, they have none of that.
Right.
They're all a very polished portrayal of what is a really difficult journey for a company to go on. But I haven't seen any, correct me if I'm wrong, any company have the bravery, the courage to talk about failure in sustainability. And if they did, it'd be hugely disarming, right? Journalists would have less to go on, right? You couldn't just call them out for greenwashing because they'd be sort of more nuanced in their story and saying that isn't a linear path to success. We're actually struggling. So I think, that there's a real opportunity for companies, PR agencies to, when they're communicating sustainability, to be more vulnerable. It's a horrible term, but that's an opportunity.
And it's an interesting point as well, because when you think of a sustainability report and the objective of it, yes, it's to highlight what they're doing, and transition is a huge part of that, and highlighting the issues. But a big chunk of it, and Esther, you can talk to this as well, is it's targeted at investors, it's targeted at stakeholders, and they want to read the positive. What they don't want to see, mistakes exactly.
Yeah.
But I think, as you mentioned, what are your thoughts on that, Esther, in terms of opening up to vulnerability in sustainability reports?
Yeah, actually, when we first started the journey, sustainability, we used very few picture because no point to show your chairman, carrying baby or giving out, a red packet and all that.
Yeah.
So we avoid doing that. And then over time, when we went digital, we allowed a lot more content. And we also learned that data is important. We try to minimize writing, because right now, no point to write a lot. Data speaks for itself. So if you look at the sustainability report, the 5 years trending, and we do have materiality study every year since 2014. So we align the top ESG material issues with risk and opportunity, and what action taken and what are the impact. So we may not use the word is failure, but we do highlight the risks and opportunities. And whether the targets are met, you can actually see from the data, because data cannot lie. Because all those, actually, I have 6 sets of audit for my sustainability report, because it's a board statement. The board doesn't feel comfortable to sign if you don't have external assurance, although it is not legally required yet. But even for myself, I want to be safe also. I want to be able to sleep well at night. So I need the operational staff to like give me the peace of mind. These are all externally assured. We have the ISO 40064, which is greenhouse gas emission. That is the biggest challenge. And then we have the GRI, reasonable level, and SASB reasonable level, TCFD, and CDSB for limited assurance. So EY is doing it. It's all publicly available. So I think the external assurance is very important. Data focus is very important. And you don't need to really spend a lot of writing anymore to convince people you are green. I feel that the most important thing is you can assess a company whether they are consistent. And where is the sustainability department's, its position is. So for us, we are very fortunate. We are independent unit. We only report to the board sustainability committee with 3 independent director and our group CEO. So with that empowerment, you can really do more to go into all the operational unit and tell them, hey, this is our strategy, this is our target, please help. So we are independent but truly integrated. So that's how the governance structure, and of course, reporting can only say that much in a year, but we also actually put online our quarterly report as well.
Rachel, could I just add? So I think, as journalists, right, it somewhat seems daunting exercise that you're going to go on if you're going to go write an article. But I think, again, you have this incredible opportunity of, instead of, when Robin mentioned about scandalized, you calling out a company, if you have the opportunity to write articles about working with the company, looking at what needs to be done, how it should be done, I think the future is a lot better that way than just calling out companies and saying you're not doing it, right? So, when you asked your question, first thing that came to my mind was, oh my God, it's a daunting exercise for you, those in media. But then again, from what they described and what you alluded to some extent, if you take a step back and instead of challenging a company as to what they're doing and see how you can suggest what needs to be done, or whether you've considered all of those things, I think that might have a far greater reach. People start getting educated on everything related to ESG, and eventually we will all get onto the same track. It's like listening to different music at different frequencies, and then suddenly you find all the frequencies all lining up. Right. So I think you do have a great opportunity.
Maybe just to add one thing to that, there is a recent example. So just for context, what my company does is we help calculate carbon emissions. And I recently came upon a sustainability report from a fairly large company. You guys, I'm sure, are using their app to shop online. I won't mention any names, but basically, they had this big statement around carbon emissions. It was like, okay, we've reduced by that much. The absolute number of emissions, how much they emit, was nowhere in the report. So I found that very, very concerning. But I mean, I'm also sometimes in a dilemma, just like journalists, sometimes maybe you get also funding from companies. Well, if I go after my clients and say oh, you're horrible, your sustainability report is crap, they're never going to want to work with me. So what I did is just raise questions hey, I noticed that you don't disclose your emission numbers. What is wrong with, what's happened? Are you facing any issues calculating that? Because if you have issues, I can help you with that. And that's kind of going at it a nice way. And of course, if we were to say ignore my message and say no, we don't want to do that, then of course, that's maybe where you get more concerned and might want to blow the whistle. But yeah, sometimes it's a bit hard, because if you go cracking the whip, people can get very defensive. Yeah.
Just to that point as well, when it comes to greenwashing articles, I think this was mentioned earlier. We just like the scandal. just to say, that's, I mean, it's true, right? They want to see headline. They want to see something that's a little bit dramatic. If we write nice stories all the time, oh, good job, great, this is wonderful, you're not going to get as many clicks. So that also poses a dilemma for journalists. Ken, you've been in the media industry for a long time covering sustainability, and I know you've had your hand up for a while for a question. What would you like to ask? Ken
I
Hickson,
suppose
sorry,
it's,
by the way.
You know, I've probably looking around, I'm probably the person who's been involved as a journalist for longer than anyone else in the room. But I've had a, like Esther, I've been involved in sustainability for some time, but somehow I'm managing to balance sustainability reporting as well as writing for clients or doing, hopefully, the right thing. But what is important, and I know Esther and CDL have been involved in the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which I think is great. If you can have something like that as a verification, as a backup to say, yes, we're a member of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, yes, we've set targets, yes, we're following up on these. We missed this target last year, but we're going to double it next year. So having things like that that give you some scientific verification and backup, having certification, having verification, having backups that come from either an industry body or a World Economic Forum or somewhere, that really makes all the difference. So as journalists, even when you're starting out and writing about whatever you get to write about, you have to apply the same thing. I've got to ask questions. What are the facts here? What are you, if you claim to be the best producer of condensed milk in the world, how do you verify how much are you producing compared with anyone else? So you just got to get those facts together. So it really comes back to asking the questions, the fact checking, the getting verification, getting some backup from an industry body or Science-Based Targets Initiative, and being able to present the facts, which is so important. I mean, I love the top heading there, sustainable journalism. I'm not quite sure what we mean by sustainable journalism. Do we mean how can we sustain the profession? Because one good way of doing it is to be credible, maintain that credibility, and not just take stuff that someone gives you.
And I think that's a challenge that many journalists face, isn't it? When you're talking about bandwidth, right? When you receive a press release and someone is claiming to be, you know, as you mentioned, have the lowest carbon footprint, plant-based alternative, the first to do this, the biggest to do this, it takes a lot of fact checking. And quite honestly, a lot of media we're under tight deadlines, whether it's to be, you know, multi-platform, print, TV, radio, whatever else, and you're churning stories. So I think that in itself can be another challenge for those in the media profession when it comes to fact checking. Robert, when you were tackling an article and you were looking to fact check, where would you go to? What do you do? If you've got a tight deadline and you want to move things across quickly.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I don't know about you guys who are journalists in the room. Do you have quotas for the number of stories you have to get out every week? I certainly do. I mean, it's not hard and fast. Sometimes you do longer form competitive stuff that take a lot longer. Sometimes it's fast turnaround stories based on reports. Often the best, as I mentioned, are for NGOs. And just your point you made earlier, I think NGOs, especially NGOs like Greenpeace, are good because a lot of them are former journalists themselves, so they know what journalists are looking for. They know, for example, like a typical strategy for an NGO is to go after the biggest company in a sector. So in banking here, it would be DBS. A favourite company they like to pick on is Asia Pulp and Paper. At the pulp and paper industry. So, and I think that model is used in journalism as well to find an audience to go after or criticise right around the biggest in the sector, because that can have the most impact, has the broader reach and has an industry-wide impact, right? So if you criticise DBS, you know, the other companies in that sector will be looking at it. But yeah, for fact checking, I think that's what's good about sustainability reports and sustainability in general. There's so much data out there. A lot of it's unverified. I think that's the problem, right? To the issue mentioned earlier on, people are claiming percentage increases or percentage reductions in carbon emissions but not declaring the baseline, which is hugely problematic. I mean, how's a journalist supposed to write a story around unverified data, right? It's a huge problem. But I think, yeah, SBTI is a big and important resource because it aligns companies' decarbonisation targets with the Paris Agreement on climate change and 1.5 degrees of warming, right? But if a company isn't aligned with that, we've got problems. But yeah, there's often too much data out there rather than too little, and not enough good data. So.
Kevin?
Yeah. Okay, I'm Kevin Lin. I'm kind of retired, although I still do projects. My question actually is, Okay, I suppose it's a broad question. There's lots of data out there, but the laws are not clear. So the first question, for example, scope 3 emissions. It's very difficult to calculate. I'm an SME, I wouldn't even know how to start. But a question to say Esther or CDL, is it possible for big companies to consultant shop, knowing that consultant A will definitely give you a lower figure than consultant B or C, and therefore you choose consultant A? Is there this problem in the industry whereby you can choose the right consultant to give you the right data, or rather the data that makes you look better than your competitors? And the second question is, despite all the rules, how robust are they? All right, there is one of your competitors recently knocked down a building that was built 10 years ago. Their buildings have all the green marks, platinum and all that. If you just look at the rating of their buildings, they are as green as CDL. But somehow I think if you knock down a building when it was built 10 years ago, and I think the predecessor building lasted about 10 years as well, how green can you get? Because the costs, what do you call the pollution, the use of materials incurred in knocking down a building and rebuilding, this should be reflected somewhere, but I suspect it's not. Can you comment on these 2 points?
Okay, so the first being,
Okay, I think I will need some help, but for
It's okay, I'll
scope
help you
3,
afterwards.
okay, I think scope 3 is not so simple. We keep talking about scope 3 challenge, which is actually a relatively new area. We learned about scope 3 when we started the SBTI application in 2017. So if you look at scope 3, there are 15 categories under the greenhouse gas protocol. Okay, that includes embodied carbon, which is from your supplier and materials, and you also include, given your tenants, carbon footprint, your investment, and even for us, our tenants, their carbon footprint is my carbon footprint. And I haven't come across with any consultants that can give us that data. Actually, the data is from within. Yeah, they cannot give us, I give you higher or lower. No, there's no such thing. But I think Quintin can answer this.
From an advisory perspective, is that something you
Technically
say?
speaking, if you ask me to help you lower your carbon footprint, I could do it. I could do it, because the GHG protocol, which is the standard for carbon footprint, allows for different calculation methodologies, different emission factor, and I could technically help you find the lowest. Have I ever seen that happen in my industry? No. Does it happen? Maybe, I don't know. But I think as there's more and more audit requirements, which Esther was mentioning earlier, that's going to become less and less possible. So just like tax, right? Your financial statement, you get them audited to make sure you didn't cheat on tax and stuff like that. We're getting the same thing for carbon accounting. So that's going to remove that problem from the equation. And the second one, which is about the building being torn down. So that's where you take what we call a life cycle approach. You look at the very beginning of the project all the way till demolition and the end. And Greenmark has done a pretty good job, because any new building, any new construction that has to go through Greenmark certification will have to go through a whole life cycle assessment approach. So you need to calculate the carbon emissions of the whole project.
How does
Should
it work? Because when someone tells me I'm going to build this building and these are the specs, I mean, if I'm BCA, I have absolutely no idea whether you're going to knock down the building in 5 years' time or 50 years' time. So how am I going to calculate this life cycle emissions?
I know, it's not something that you deal with from a legal perspective.
Okay, why I'm looking at this is because just 2 weeks ago, I went on a course for carbon management, right? And how to calculate. And I was like, oh my God, I can't keep up. And they talked about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And even when we're discussing scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, direct, indirect, and all that, right, you have to take a step back. All right, so he may be good at it now, but some of us are still learning, right? So it's a very difficult process. And then how to calculate that? You've got these international standards that you follow. So it comes back to who's using which of the international standards, and whether your international standards, the figures are different. And then even in the breakdown, it's a bit difficult to calculate. So I don't know about the shopping. I think it can happen. You might find people with results that are slightly different, but I don't think as we progress forward, right, it's going to be, the difference is going to be smaller and smaller.
Okay,
Like calculating your building and all that, that's a complex exercise. What the building is going to be like and whether it's going to work.
Okay, I'm very mindful of time. We've got a question from online, but we'll take one more from the audience. You know, you had your hand up.
To your point, it's quite important that data, because if you don't have 3 years of baseline data, you can't extrapolate them. So it's very difficult to do those numbers.
Sorry, would you
I have a question. I was what?
Sally?
Sally Clark.
Okay.
Sally Clark, yeah. So my question is around, I was speaking to a potential project I might be doing. It's an iron ore manufacturer. They're third generation iron ore producer out of India. They are moving into setting up an accelerator fund for clean tech. For new innovation in terms of the mining sector, and companies from across the world, mining conglomerates are interested in kickstarting this off. The question was, what best practice, do you have best practice examples of mining industries that have actually managed to push out targets that they've actually met? Have you read about any companies, mining companies that actually have done well from a sustainability front? Or even mediocre?
Anyone on the panel?
That's a hard one.
It is, but if you're full of energy, right, you're third generation in this mining conglomerate family, you want to do the right thing. You're working with the World Economic Forum, you really want to do the right thing. How do you go about it? Who do you learn from?
So there is one resource that was built by the European Union, which has like best available techniques for a lot of industrial sector. So back when I was working on energy efficiency with a lot of like very polluting companies, so I was going to steel factories, cement, etc. I mean, sadly, we still need those materials, right, to build buildings and stuff. They could tap on those resources to actually look at what are the best practices. But then it's like, it always comes down to ROI, right? Because even if you want to take a project to make your manufacturing greener, is like, when do you see the payback? And I think the things like carbon tax are helping to bring the ROI like much shorter, and are going to incentivize those companies to do more projects to reduce their emissions.
Sally, I'll be speaking to a number of miners tomorrow. Why don't you pass me your contact and we can follow up after?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've just got one more question. I've got to take it from online, I'm afraid, just in terms of time. And that is a really great question to wrap up today's session. And it's from Lakshmi. She says, on the topic, it would be insightful for the speakers to share a final word of good practice, best practice, and what perhaps to avoid as a concluding view. It's quite a broad question, but perhaps we could get a quick summary from each of you, just to end on a positive note, a best practice going forward. We'll start with Anil.
Oh my God, I don't even know where to start. Only thing is education. I think we need to get educated, right? And it's an incredible journey of getting educated on what's required. I suppose if you're in a particular industry, you can focus, take it from that angle, right? So it might be easier. Like for me, it's going to be so wide. I've got so many different industries that I got to take care of. Where do I start? So my point is just education. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and for me, it's the keep track, always keep track. If you don't keep track, you lose track. So I count on Excel sheet a lot. And also because we are clothes, we're handling clothes. So we go by kg, we go by item. So always keep track, otherwise we lose track. And also integrity. You say A, don't go and do B and C, you know? Just say what you mean and do what you mean. Yeah.
All right, education taken, track taken. I guess I would say like try to be authentic. I know it's not easy, but Robin mentioned about vulnerability. There is like one company I ever saw, like their sustainability report was called "We Fucked Up," and it was all about like what went wrong. You could say it was also a bit of a PR stunt to try to go to the complete polar opposite, but I think bringing authenticity into sustainability communication would go a long way.
I think he just took my word back. I have another one, which is actually the alignment is important because there's global standard, there's national standards, and climate goals, and all sort of things. So for companies to be able to really work on something, add value by embracing sustainability is to align, and but also have to be pragmatic. Yeah, and don't overcommit and don't overpromise. I would rather over-deliver than over-promise.
Yeah, just I guess for journalists or communicators, the corporate vulnerability thing's been taken. But I'd say, yeah, just ask more questions, right? Question what you're being told in sustainability reports, especially because I think there's so much nonsense and greenwash there. For a journalist, There's so much to write about in sustainability if you ask the right questions. There's lots of good people out there who can help you verify whether or not what you're being told and what you're communicating to your readers is true or not. So yeah, it's a huge opportunity.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists today. Can we have another round of applause? Thank you all for joining us in person and online. It's been absolutely great to have all of you with us. We do have refreshments at the back. If you haven't already helped yourself, please go ahead. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Actually,